Here we are in part 2 of our lesson for this Wednesday. And now we're going to talk about Constantine the Great. Remember when we're talking about in ancient history about people having the title the Great doesn't usually mean that they were a great person, someone that you'd ask to help you move or tell your biggest secret. When we say the Great in especially ancient history, you're usually referring to someone who had great power and great influence. Not necessarily that they were a great guy. I mean, Constantine was pretty brutal, especially in getting rid of all the competition so he could become the sole ruler of Rome. When he was a Roman soldier, he committed some really rough acts against different barbarian tribes. He had two different kings of the Franks that he had fed to wild animals in a gladiator arena. He could be a pretty tough guy. The great doesn't mean that he is a great guy. Just remember that. So Constantine takes control after Diocletian retires, and Diocletian, after stepping down, is pretty much powerless to stop this from happening. And Constantine pretty much takes all of Diocletian's reforms and splitting it up into a tetrarchy. He's like, nah, rule by 4. No, let's just have rule for me. And Constantine most likely came from the eastern part of Europe. Some estimates have in present-day Croatia, somewhere in the Balkans, maybe near Greece. And in a lot of ways, Constantine feels that the western half of the empire is pretty much useless. It's done. And that the east is now the real center of the empire. And he moves more and more and more to move away from a Roman Empire that's centered around Rome, and more one that's centered around his new empire, his new Rome in the east. Where is that going to be? So Constantine the Great builds Constantinople the Great. Constantinople, the city that he builds, will become one of the largest, most affluent cities for more than 1,000 years after his establishment. This was a city that was built in a location that other cities had been in. For example, Byzantium, which was a Greek city, was once there. And he kind of builds off of that on top of it and recreates it and reimagines this city into this massive new structure. This new Rome, he hopes, will have the same glory as Rome did at the height of Augustus. And it's in a great location. If you look, here's the Aegean Sea. There's Greece and Turkey. Here's the Aegean Sea, which is part of the Mediterranean Sea. And then there's this body of water here. See that? And a very small, thin, straight, a very thin body of water that connects to the Black Sea. So if you control this spot, this strait, which is called the Bosporus Strait, you can control access between these two major bodies of water, can control trade between them. It's a big deal. And Constantinople has a natural harbor on this strait. It is a perfect place to build an affluent, wealthy city, and that's what it'll become. You see that the city of Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, stands at Constantinople today. When the Ottoman Turks take over and overthrow the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, in the 16th century, they will rename the city as Istanbul. But that name of Byzantine, as I previously mentioned, will come to kind of symbolize the culture of the Eastern Roman Empire. Here you see the artist's rendering of what Constantinople looked like in its heyday. Large Circus Maximus-like amphitheater, the enormous Hagia Sophia, which is a large church that is going to be a sign of something that Constantine will be doing in his life. So Constantine, in a lot of ways, no longer looked to Rome as being the way of the empire. and he wanted to kind of pull himself more and more away from a lot of things that have been traditionally Roman. He pulls a lot of money and resources away from the West. He pulls a lot of the military away from the West, and this is going to leave the West more and more vulnerable to the Huns and the Germanic barbarians that are fleeing the Huns, who then are like putting pressure on the Romans to do something, and the Romans are doing less and less and less. And this is going to make the German barbarians more and more apt to attack the Romans. We're going to see that he passes a lot of pretty strict laws that take away a lot of the freedom that Roman citizens had, even during the empire. You no longer could choose what your occupation was. You no longer could choose what your city was. You had to, if your dad was a carpenter, you had to be a carpenter. If your dad was a farmer, you had to be a farmer. Farmers were not allowed to leave their land, and essentially became more or less employees of the government. Had to work for the government, almost became slaves to the government. And people less and less and less were working for themselves, and more and more were working for Constantine and for Rome. And Rome is becoming more and more authoritarian under the rule of Constantine. Not just Rome, the city, but the entire empire. Another big, giant shift that Constantine is going to have in moving Rome away from its traditional ways is going to be in religion. And that is going to be in his conversion to Christianity. Christianity is a religion that people follow the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in Judea, which was a Roman province, in present-day Israel. Followers of Christianity believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah or the Son of God, and that by following him they can have salvation or everlasting life. Christians who are monotheistic and were following the teachings of a humble, born poor carpenter were often seen as a blight to the polytheistic Romans, and were really horribly treated. For more than 300 years, we talked about Nero and others just doing horrible treatment to the Christians, and Christians having to hide their faith for hundreds of years, and often being martyred or killed for their faith. Even though Christianity was oppressed, it continued to grow quite a bit. And as Constantine is pushing his rivals who were controlling parts of Rome, of the former Tetrarchy, to take full control of the empire, when he was pretty much in the last battle against the guy that was ruling Rome, before he was going to battle, he said that he had a vision, that he saw a cross in the sky. And that night he dreamt that Christ sent a sign to him to conquer under this sign, to conquer under the cross. And from then on, he's going to make the cross the banner of his army. And we're going to see that more and more Constantine is going to move more and more to make Christianity an official religion of the state, the government of Rome. That the government says that this is the religion, and that there's very little taking away more and more choice to follow any other faith but Christianity. And under Constantine, good things that he does is he legalizes Christianity. He ends the laws that allow for the persecution of its followers. He passes a number of laws that reflect Christian values. For example, we mentioned that Christians had been persecuted by being forced into gladiatorial combat, being attacked by animals in the Colosseum, and he bans gladiatorial combat. He bans crucifixions, which is a form of execution the Romans used in killing Jesus of Nazareth and many other followers of Christianity. He starts using the tax money that he put in place throughout the empire to start building Christian churches. So now the government is building the church. And we're going to see that the government is going to be establishing the church more and more. And that's going to be a pretty big move. Eventually, these moves will lead to, not during Constantine's time, but for, I believe it's the Emperor Theodosius, that is going to make Christianity official religion of the empire. But a lot of the groundwork for that is laid by Constantine. Constantine himself, throughout his rule, will openly talk about worshiping Christianity, but will officially become a Christian on his deathbed when he is baptized. With Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, we're going to see that is then going to rapidly spread throughout Europe, throughout parts of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And eventually we're going to see that Christianity will be the most widely practiced religion in the world. And a lot of that comes from the act of Constantine pushing it to become the main legal religion of Rome. Wow. The power of one guy. So, my question for you for this lesson is, why did the Roman Empire split? And describe one impact of the rule of Diocletian and one impact of the rule of Constantine. We'll continue our exploration of the fall of Rome tomorrow. Have a marvelous one.